Oh, yeah.
Okay, guys, so for 8.3, we're going to be calculating IQR and identifying outliers. So what is IQR? IQR stands for the inner quartile range. Okay, so it has to do with, on your box and whisker plot, the inner quartile is the box part, because those are the two middle quartiles. And the inner quartile range, or we can call it IQR, measures how far the data is spread out from the median, so how spread out the data is. So to calculate the IQR, you are going to take quartile 3 and subtract quartile 1. So our first example, and what I'm going to have you guys do is you don't need to write down the question, but I do want you to write down the chart. Okay, so make sure you have the chart copied into your notes. But here's our example. Our situation is that Coach Peterson's Middletown 9th grade football team is having a tough season. The team is struggling to win games. So he is trying to determine why his team has won only a few times this year. And this table shows the points scored in games in 2011 and 2012. So the top row is for every single game how many points the team scored in 2011, and the bottom row is how many points the team scored in each game in 2012. So what we're going to do before we even start calculating the IQR for each of these sets of data is we need to identify all of the different parts. So we're going to do the 5-number summary for each year, and then we're going to use that 5-number summary to calculate. So if you guys notice, all of the data is already in order. So what would our minimum be for 2011? 10. So label it. Okay, that's the easy one. Thank you. Okay, what would the maximum be for 2011? 35, so label that max. Okay, so our smallest one is our min, our largest one is our max, and what I want you guys to, or let's find the median. So the way I do the median is I start at my min and my max, and then I go in one, and then I go in one more, one more. So what would our median be? 24, so label it median. Okay, and then if you guys remember, Q1 is half of the lower half. So we start at our min and our median, and we go in, or I'm sorry, we don't. We leave our median off because it's part of the median. So we start at 22 and 10, and then we go in. So our Q1 is 17. And then we do the same thing for Q3, which is the middle of the upper half. So we don't include our median because our median is its own separate thing. So we start at 24 and 35 and work our way in. So Q3 is 28. Okay, so make sure you label it. So I want you guys to do the exact same thing, do the 5-number summary for 2012 for me. So label min, max, Q1, Q3, and the median. So guys, what is our minimum for 2012? 0. What is our maximum? Good. What is our median? 24, and it should be the first one, right? And what's Q1? 17. And Q3? 25. Okay, so you just have to have everything labeled for me. So here's what we want to do. We want to calculate the IQR, not the IWR, for each year and interpret what it means. So I'm going to do 2011 with you, and then I'm going to have you guys do 2012, okay? So 2011, so let's label it. So our formula for IQR is Q3 minus Q1. So to calculate the IQR, we're going to take Q3, which in 2011 was 28, and we're going to subtract Q1, which in 2011 was 17. So in 2011, the IQR, or the inner quartile range, was 11. So what does this mean? The inner quartile range means what the range between the middle 50%. So it's taking the highest value in the middle 50% and the lowest value in the middle 50% and subtracting them. So on your box and whisker plot, it's the box. So it's taking the very end of the box and the other end of the box and subtracting them. So this means that in 2011, the middle 50% of the points scored have a range of 11 points. Okay, so we're taking the difference between the upper part of the middle 50 and the lower part of the middle 50. So basically, we're kind of calculating how big the box is on that box and whisker plot, how wide it is. So what I want you guys to do is do the exact same thing, but for 2012. So determine the IQR for 2012. Tell me what it means in words. Okay, so if I'm trying to calculate IQR for 2012, what two numbers am I going to be subtracting? 25 minus 17. So what is your IQR for 2012? 8, right? 25 minus 17. So what does this mean? This means that in 2012, the middle 50% of points have a range of what? Of 8. So let's think about what this means in terms of our box and whisker plot. In terms of our box and whisker plot, which year has a larger box? 2011 or 2012? 2011, because it ranges from between 11 points, right? That first value in the box and that last value in the box are 11 points apart. In 2012, they're 8 points apart, so it's a much smaller box. So that 50% of all of the points scored lie closer together. So more of the points scored are closer together than in 2011, where they were a little bit more spread out. Okay. Something else that has to do with all of this, and that is called an outlier. How many of you have heard of the word outlier before? Okay, we've talked about it for a really long time. An outlier is a data value that is significantly greater or lesser than other data values in a data set. So it's like if we were to calculate the heights of every single person in this room, but then I brought in Shaquille O'Neal. He would be an outlier because he is way taller than every other person in this room. So an outlier is somebody or a piece of data that is significantly greater or lesser than other values. They can affect the other statistics of the data set. So we need to know if there are outliers and how to find outliers. Okay, so when we're talking about outliers, because it's either like the small values that either skew our data or the really, really large values that skew our data, we have two things that we need to calculate called an upper fence and a lower fence. Okay, so our lower fence is any value that is less than the acceptable limit from the other data. So it's kind of like you're building a fence around the data, and if any value is less than that lower fence, it's considered an outlier. So you have a formula for that. Your lower fence is calculated by taking Q1, which is the smallest part of that box, and subtracting the IQR times 1.5. So you're going to multiply your IQR times 1.5 and then subtract it from Q1. And that's going to give you kind of your limit of what the lowest value can be. Anything less than that is considered an outlier. Upper fence is the same thing, but because we're looking at the greater values, we're looking at everything that is above that Q3. So for your upper fence, it is a value greater than the acceptable limit from the other data, and you're going to take Q3 and add IQR times 1.5. Okay, so lower fence, we're subtracting from Q1 because we're looking for everything that's less than Q1. Upper fence, we're going to add to Q3 because we're looking for those values that are greater than Q3. Okay, and then if anything falls greater than or less than those values, they are considered outliers. Okay, so example 2, we're going to take that football data and we're going to determine if there are any outliers in the football scores data set. So we're going to now determine if in 2011 or 2012, if there were any outliers that are affecting our data. So let's do 2011 first. So let's label it 2011. And to calculate or to determine if we have any outliers, we first need to calculate our upper and our lower fence. So our lower fence is equal to Q1 minus, I'm going to rewrite the formula, Q1 minus IQR times 1.5. So our Q1 for the lower fence was 17 minus the IQR for 2011 was 11, and then you're going to multiply that by 1.5. I want you guys to remember that order of operations always matters, so in calculating our lower fence, we have to do the 11 times 1.5 first, okay? So you can use a calculator for that. It comes out to 16.5. But then when you subtract 16.5 from 17, you get a lower fence of 0.5, okay? So that comes out to 17 minus 16.5, and then you get an answer of 0.5, okay? So that's our lower fence. So let's take, before we calculate the upper fence, let's take a look at this. So the lower fence means that that's my cutoff. If I have any data values less than 0.5, then they're considered an outlier. So if we go back and look at the chart, in 2011, are there any scores that are less than half a point? Can you score half a point in football? So are there any outliers on the lower end? No. So let's look at the upper fence and determine if there are any outliers on the upper end. So our upper fence is Q3 plus IQR times 1.5. So Q3 for 2011 was 28 plus the same thing, 11 times 1.5. So that's 28 plus 16.5 because we already calculated that part. So our upper fence for 2011 is going to come out to 44.5. So let's look at our chart. Were there any scores greater than 44.5 in 2011? In just 2011. So are there any outliers in 2011 at all? No. So what I want you guys to do is write that down. So somewhere on mine I'm running out of room, but off to the side I'm going to write for 2011 there are no outliers. Okay, so your upper and your lower fence just tell you kind of what the cutoff point is, all right? So what I want you guys to do with your groups, you guys can all work on this together, determine if there were any outliers in 2012. Okay, so to find the lower fence, I'm not going to write the formula again. So what was Q1 for 2012? 17. Minus, what was the IQR? 8. So 8 times 1.5. So what did you guys get for the lower fence in 2012? 5. So are there any outliers? Yes. What values in 2012 are considered outliers on the lower end? The 0. Okay? So the 5 is the cutoff, and anything less than the 5 is considered an outlier. Does that make sense? Okay, so to calculate the upper fence, we're going to take Q3, which for 2012 was what? 25 minus 8 times 1.5. So what did you guys get for your upper fence? 37. Were there any outliers on the upper end? Yes. How many? Also 1, and that was 45, right? So what this is saying is that in 2011, all of our points were kind of pretty clustered together. There wasn't any games where we had way too little points or way too many. But in 2012, there was one game where we didn't score anything, and that really skewed our data. And then in 2000, there was one game where we scored a ton of points, and that really skewed our data. So looking at the different years, in 2011, for the most part, we did better because there aren't any outliers in that data. Does that make sense? But if there are outliers, that means that there are data points that are skewing our data either one way or the other. So in 2012, there are outliers. So I would write that in 2012, let's say 0 and 45 are outliers. Okay? So our fences help us determine if we have outliers and if we do, what they are. Okay, so the next part, I'm going to have you guys construct a box and whisker plot for just 2012, but we're going to do two. We're going to do one with the data that includes the outliers, and then we're going to do one with the data that does not include the outliers. So what I want you guys to do is draw two number lines for me first, and we're going to do this together. So for my number lines, I started at 0 points, and then I counted by 5. So 5, this one would be 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. And that should include all of our data. Okay? So, we're going to construct two box and whisker plots. Now, for our box and whisker plots, we always need to label them. So this box and whisker plot is going to be showing the 2012 football team points. That's what the whole thing is showing. And then, so if the entire box and whisker plot is showing the 2012 football team points, what are these numbers representing? 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. The points scored, right? So number of points scored. So make sure you label both of those. So you always need to make sure that you are labeling your chart so that way I know what it is I'm looking at. If on a test or a quiz you don't label your chart, I will have to take points off because I can't look at a chart and know what it is I'm supposed to be reading if you don't label and tell me what everything is. Okay? So the entire chart is going to be talking about the football team and their points, but each of these numbers on the number line represent the points scored. Okay? So let's do the box and whisker plot first with the data that was given to us. So our minimum was what, guys? 0. So you're going to put your line at 0, right? And then what was Q1? 17. Okay, so that's the start of our box. So here's 15. 17 is going to be somewhere in between 15 and 20. So let's just do that and then connect your whisker to the start of your box. What was Q3? 25. So this is 20, 25. So our box goes all the way to 25. It's a small box. And that should make sense, right? Because our IQR was only 8. So it was smaller. What was the median? Because we have to write or identify the median. 24. So the median is like right here. And our maximum was 45, right? So it goes all the way out to 45. 45? 35. So this is our box and whisker plot for 2012. Dana had mentioned, wow, our box is really small, which should make sense because our inner quartile range was really small. And what do you guys notice about the whiskers? They're really long because we have outliers. So what we're going to do now is we are going to do another box and whisker plot for our data, but we're not going to include the outliers. So if you guys go back to your chart, if we do not include the outlier 0, what would our minimum value be? 7. So you're going to start your box and whisker plot at 7. So that's going to be, here's 5, 7 is like somewhere in between. And then our box is going to stay the same because that middle data doesn't change. So our Q1 is at 17, and it goes to 25. And then our median is still at 24. So there's our first whisker. And our outlier of 45, the maximum, was an outlier. So if we're not including the maximum, which is an outlier, what would our new maximum be? 27. So our second whisker is going to go all the way to 27. So here is 25. 27 is somewhere in between 25 and 30. The last thing you have to do is, in a box and whisker plot, if you are not counting the outliers, we put little asterisks or those little stars where the outliers are. So we know that there were outliers, but we eliminated them. So 0 was an outlier, so put a star there. And 45 was an outlier, so put a star there. Okay? What is the difference between our top box and whisker plot and our bottom box and whisker plot? Yeah, the whiskers are a lot smaller, and that's because if you guys notice, look at the difference between where we started on the lower end and where our outlier was. And especially look at the difference over here. So these outliers were totally skewing our data, right? So if we don't include the outliers, we have a much better representation of where most of our points was scored. And then we put the asterisks there to indicate that that's where the outliers were. Okay? Example 3, I'm going to give you a box and whisker plot, and we're going to calculate the IQR, and then we're also going to determine whether there are any outliers for each one. Okay, so this box and whisker plot goes from 0, and it's counting by 200s all the way to 1200. Our minimum is in between 200 and 400, but is a little closer to 200. Q1, Q3, and then our maximum. Okay, guys, so here's how we're going to start. In order to calculate IQR and then our upper and our lower fences, we need to have all of the different pieces of our box and whisker plot labeled. So this first part of your whisker, remember, is your minimum. And whereabout does that minimum look like it's occurring? This is 200 and 400. 300 would be somewhere right here, and it looks like that's right in between. So what would you call it? About 250. So let's call our minimum 250. So label it. This part right here, the first part of our box, what's that called? Q1. Where do you think Q1 is occurring? About 350. So let's label that 350. Our median should be easy. What's our median? 400. So just label it median. The end part of our box, what's that called? Q3. That one's also easy. Where is that occurring? 600. And then our max looks like it's about, what? 1,050? Okay. So we have all of our different parts labeled. So the first thing we need to do is we need to determine what the IQR is. So IQR, remember, is Q3 minus Q1. Q3 is what? 600 minus Q1, which is 350. So our IQR is 250. That's the first step. Okay, so to determine if we have any outliers, we need to calculate our lower fence. Lower fence is Q1 minus IQR times 1.5. What is Q1? 350. So that's going to be 350 minus, in parentheses, IQR. So 250 times 1.5. So 250 times 1.5 is 375. So that's going to be 350 minus 375. So what is our lower fence? Negative 25. So are there any outliers on the lower end? No, because none of our data goes less than 0, right? So there's no outliers on the lower end. So let's check our upper fence. Upper fence is Q3 plus IQR times 1.5. So Q3 is 600 plus 250 times 1.5. We already determined what 250 times 1.5 is. That's 375. So our our upper fence is going to be 975. So are there outliers on the upper end? Yes, there are, because 975 would be somewhere right here. And we definitely have at least one value. Can we determine exactly how many outliers we have? No, because there could be this maximum, but there could be another data point somewhere in there. So we don't have to say what the outliers are exactly, because we can't determine that from a box and whisker plot, but we can say that there are outliers. So that's all I want to know is, are there outliers, yes or no? Okay. So here's example 4. It's the same number line, just a different box and whisker plot on top. And I want the exact same thing. So what is the IQR, and are there any outliers? So you'll need to calculate IQR. You'll need to calculate the lower fence and the upper fence. Okay, but first you need to determine all of the different points of the 5-number summary. All right, so you should have got for your IQR 150, yes? Okay, what'd you get for the lower fence? I got 175. And my upper fence, I got 775. So are there any outliers? Yes, there are outliers. Okay?